Awesome. All right. Thanks, Sarah. Cool. As mentioned, my name's Alan. For whoever I haven't met, today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence in medicine, potential biases, and health inequities. No conflicts of interest to disclose. Acknowledgements to Drs. Thornton, Schiefling, and Tong. They definitely helped me tinker through the presentation and help me make it less worse than it was. So really our learning goals are going to be get a general sense for what artificial intelligence is, how AI is used in medicine today, potential biases and inequities in medicine related to AI, and then solutions recommendations. I want to have a caveat that I'm not a computer scientist. I didn't major in it or I have a strong background in it. I chose this just because it's really interesting. I think it's going to play a big role in our future. And then also to be less ignorant about the topic, just because I know it's, again, going to be a bigger and bigger thing in our lives. First off, I wanted to see if anybody uses AI. I know there's been a lot of new developments over the last 6 months or so. Does anybody use AI on a daily or weekly basis? I know there's like ChatGPT, Toomey, a lot of other things. Google Maps. Yeah, that's kind of AI, yeah. Yeah, so ChatGPT, especially for peeps that are applying to fellowship or applying to jobs or cover letters, definitely would recommend checking that out to see if it's helpful for you. YouTube, yeah, algorithm. I think one of the big things is that we use AI, whether we know we're using it or not. So I think that in itself is important to know. Yeah, and I think these specific AI like ChatGPT, these chatbots or something else that we're using, Dragon in itself and on Epic is AI as well. So if you use that, Spotify, you got targeted ads. Yeah, nice. Cool, yeah. So yeah, definitely very prevalent on one way or another in our day-to-day. So just kind of a big definition about AI. So essentially, it's a branch of computer sciences that focuses on creating machines that can simulate what we can do, our intelligence and our behavior. In medicine, it's currently being used in medical imaging, drug discovery, therapy, personalized medicine, and EHRs, and really in clinical decision making. Less so on the latter end of it, and more so on the front end of the medical imaging right now in drug discovery. I think right now it's becoming more and more prevalent in EHRs. And clinical decision making, I think, is one of the big things that's probably going to come up here in the next few years. So AI is really kind of like medicine. When somebody says I'm in medicine, or really means a lot, it can mean a lot of different things. Kind of the same thing with artificial intelligence. It's really a big branch of this computer science, and we have machine learning and natural language processing are going to be the two things that we talk about, which are two subsets. But just so everybody's aware, there's like robotics, there's like neural network, there's a bunch of different subsets of AI. These two, I feel like after my research, are two of the big players that we see in medicine a lot, and we'll focus a lot on these, specifically the machine learning. So a little definition of machine learning, and I'll try to keep all the definitions as basic as possible for me to really understand. So machine learning is a way essentially to teach computers how to learn and make decisions without them being explicitly told to. The way it works is by showing computer lots of examples of something and letting them learn these patterns so they can eventually make predictions and decisions on their own. And we'll spend a little time on machine learning here for a second. So machine learning here, there's three big steps, basic steps. Essentially, the first step is getting data in there, whether it's vital signs, whether it's demographics. You collect the data, and then you have this algorithm that computer scientists make, so you can make yourself with other AI. And then once you have that data, you train the algorithm and you feed it tons of information, so it's able to recognize patterns and eventually develop models based on these patterns. Once a model is deployed, then you're able to you train it to see if it's validated, and it's able to make eventually with the goal of making predictions and decisions when you give it new data that it hasn't seen before. Kind of a small example, just so we can put it in medical terms now. So a sample essentially sepsis in medicine here. So, and this is actually going to be an example that we see later on in a presentation. But essentially, just imagine you're creating this machine learning algorithm. You're giving tons of data in relation to sepsis for patients, medical records, demographics, medical history, vital signs, lab results, infection history, essentially big things that we want to know about the patient, all these data points. Then we create machine learning algorithms, again, through computer scientists, or we can create them through AI. So a lot of the AI in itself has become very autonomous to where you're able to create algorithms without knowing how to create algorithms because the AI is making it for you, which is really interesting in itself. So essentially, you get this data, you feed it to algorithm, and it starts to identify patterns, and it's able to see the features on there. You're able to train it on these patterns, and eventually it's able to kind of spit out this information about having patients that are higher risk of being in sepsis based on the data you're giving it. So that's kind of the big 10,000 foot picture of it, but we'll get into a little more details. But I kind of wanted to make it a little bit on the medical end of it, so we can see have a little bit understanding of it. The other big thing we'll talk about today is language processing. Essentially, just focus on teaching computers to understand and generate human language. It's able to extract like this non-structured information from medical reports, from clinical notes, and it's really able to create its own language, whether it's English, whether it's another language that they're using. ChatGPT is primarily, and I'll refer to it just because it's in vogue right now. It's one of the big things that's in the media. That in itself is a language processing, but it also uses machine learning as well. Applications of NLP in medicine. It can help create patient reports, it help create clinical notes, ID patient symptoms and diagnosis. If you feed it a bunch of unstructured medical records, in theory, it's able to pop out diagnosis, symptoms, medications, allergies from said medical records. Eventually, one of the things that we're seeing now is creating these chatbots to answer questions. Patients with questions about common questions or helpful responses to patients that are asking questions on their inbox. So in theory, and we'll talk about this in a little detail, these chatbots or this NLP are able to help you take some of the burden off in theory. So you're not always having to keep up with your chatbots, and you feel comfortable and you trust it enough. And I think that's a big hurdle here at this point, is creating something that you trust enough to where you're able to kind of let it run by itself and making sure your patients are taken care of. That was kind of a big run through into like the layman persons of machine learning and NLP. Any questions currently right now? Go. All right. So we're going to next thing we're going to move on to essentially is going to be AI being used today in medicine here. And then I'll try to keep it short and just kind of brief. The first example we're going to see essentially is going to be this big partnership that Microsoft and Epic has. Obviously, everybody's familiar with Epic here. Everyone's familiar with Microsoft. They've been working together for about 3 or 4 years now. And they recently, as of the last week, they have announced like a big collaboration when it comes to working together with the goal of improving patient outcomes and decreasing the burden on the provider. So specifically, they're really trying to generate Epic's huge EHR systems and Microsoft's computer platform. The Azure platform is essentially one of the OpenAI is like the mother company of ChatGPT. So they're really able to create, like they're able to try to get together and create like this model to improve patient outcomes. Specifically right now, San Diego, UW, not us, Wisconsin, and Stanford are organizations currently being deployed right now as to help generate responses on your inbox. They're able to generate responses on messages between providers. So these are things that are actually moving right now, and here in the next, I think, few years, we'll start seeing it kick off in the mainstream if it's successful within these systems. I think specifically they chose them because Wisconsin is where Epic is. I think they're from the Midwest, Stanford. Silicon Valley, and then San Diego also being close to them. Another example that AI is currently used for today in the GI side, essentially something called GI Genius is a medical device that uses ML algorithms to assist GI docs in detecting these polyps that are hard to see in the human eye. So essentially it uses real-time data. It's been trained to see millions of different colonoscopies and what a normal bowel looks like, what abnormal bowel looks like. And it's able to use real-time data and feedback to the GI doc to give the GI doc potentially like a flag up, like, hey, this polyp is abnormal looking. And I think at the end of the day, we always have to trust the providers, but I think it's something that we could augment with the providers, because I think some of these serrated polyps are difficult to detect if they're flat looking. There was a randomized control study that actually helped increase the adenoma detection by 14%. So it's being used today, and it's actually being used successfully in some instances here. Another example essentially is going to be during COVID-19. There was a multi-clinical trial evaluating these machine learning algorithms, kind of the example we talked about earlier about having patients that were worried about whether they're septic or worried about them becoming intubated. This multi-clinical trial created this algorithm successfully, and it was able to pick up higher sensitivity compared to this Muse, which is a scoring system that was used back in the day, not back in the day, a couple of years ago, currently in a couple of years ago, to see which patients were being intubated or not. So this in itself is another successful example of how machine learning was implemented. Specifically, this one was implemented kind of on the fly because they were seeing so many patients during that peak of COVID-19 being intubated. And it did show like promising data on there. Another big thing I thought was interesting, it's specifically for the HEMONC affinity people, there's something called Cancer LinkedIn, which is created by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which is like this huge machine learning platform. Over 5.3 million people are involved in there, and essentially just inputs tons of their data, their treatment, their regimen, their side effects, their outcomes, and it's able to create a lot of these algorithms, and it's able in theory to personalize medicine in regards to the individual characteristics of the patient. Just briefly talking about something that was used with Cancer LinQ. This study here, which essentially immune checkpoint inhibitors have significant cardiac symptoms, adverse effects due to the IL immune checkpoint inhibitors. And again, another study that showed that they was able to create this model to help minimize, to help alert providers to like, hey, this patient's going to have a potentially an adverse outcome based on this data that was put in. Keep an eye on them, or maybe this specific chemotherapy is not the best for them. Cool. And then we're going to break out on these sessions here, just based on these 4 examples, and I'll put a link here about potential biases. Before we talk about the biases, I'd love to hear what y'all's thoughts are about like potential biases that could develop from the examples given, or y'all don't have to specifically focus on these examples given, but potential biases on AI that was given here. So let me. And I'm just going to attach it so when y'all go to your breakout rooms, you're able to kind of reference the headlines from these. Joe, I don't know if it's cool if we can go to our breakout sessions now, possible. Awesome, thank you. All right, I'd love to hear what some of y'all's thoughts were, some of the discussions were. Y'all can either type it or unmute yourselves, whatever is easiest, about potential biases on here. I know specifically with our group, we chatted about like the data that's put in is only as good as the data that puts out. So when you're creating these algorithms, um, the data that the machine learning has, as we talked about, you're having all these different examples of like these pictures that are being come in. If then they in themselves are a little biased, and we'll chat about that here in a second, within themselves can cause problems as well.
One of the things that we talked about in our group, or a couple of things, was the fact that machine learning can amplify bias that's already present. Essentially, there is bias inherent in the algorithms and from the programmers themselves that can be even subconscious. And once it's in the program, it can be very hard to spot and understand, because you think it's just coming from a program that doesn't care. And it can also be hard to correct because they're very complex algorithms. It's not just like a tune-up. And the other part is an over-reliance long-term. Looking at for example, the GI doc, well, it's really cool tech, and it shows, all right, well, it improves adenoma detection rate by 14%. Over time, you could see a world where, now gastroenterologists are just relying on it. They're just kind of pulling back the scope and going everywhere, but not really heavily looking at the screen, or to a much less detailed way. And, all of a sudden, gastroenterologists are not nearly as skilled at detecting, small adenomas, just because they're not getting in the same quality of reps. And so you could see a study then, 10 years from now saying, all right, well, AI is now, instead of 14%, it's 50% better at adenoma detection rate. And it's not because the algorithm has even gotten any better. It's more so because gastroenterologists have gotten worse. And the deterioration of those kind of like primary skills. And that's, an easy example, but I'm sure that there are tons of examples of like that throughout the space. What the consequences of those kind of things are in the long term is hard to know, but it's probably not great.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alex. The big thing about like these things are only going to get better, right? Because it's the more it sees and the more data it gets, the more and more accurate it's going to get. But I really haven't thought about how lax we can get from that data getting better. That's a really good thought as well. There's a lot to say. I was primarily thinking about like how it's going to get better, but as far as like our production and our technique, and as proceduralists or people that are doing that, like how it might decrease our technique and our skill as well. Someone mentioned, is it bad if Lily mentioned, is it bad if doctors get worse at detecting things and diagnosing things? I would think so, right? I think at the end of the day, I think one of the big things I want to convey through this talk is that we can rely on machines and AI, and I don't want to go Terminator on everybody, but like we can rely on everyone as much as we rely on ourselves, right? So I think having AI always as a backup and not primarily as, it's going to get better at detecting eventually than GI docs just by the means of it. But I think relying and always trying to, keep up as much as AI is moving forward with us is something that we always need to keep in mind. And then someone else mentioned, Renata mentioned, physical exam deteriorating with better bedside diagnostic tech. Yeah, I think the same answer, right? We always have to try to keep up with that. Yeah, great talk, guys. All right, cool. Well, now we're going to move into biases and equities here. And then we'll talk about specifically the problem selection bias, data selection, algorithm development, post-deployment. So we'll kind of try to hit on these here as well. And this is a really good article that a lot of my presentation came from, and essentially is a really good article if anybody wanted to read good AI with the GI perspective, but specifically a really good overall AI article here. So data collection biases here. So it's really defined, and I'll try to keep these simple definitions. So data used to train and evaluate machine learning models. It's not representative of a generalized population, which can lead to biased predictions from these models and inaccurate conclusions on there. So let's go back to one of the things that we talked about earlier, this Microsoft Epic big collaboration that's going to affect us eventually for better or for worse if we're using Epic here when we move forward from residency. So biases in EHR may arise to like different patient populations, access to care, whether patients have availability to EHR systems. Uninsured Black, Hispanic, and Medicaid patients were less likely to go to a PCP that use an EHR system or EHR systems that are connected within each other compared to white patients with private insurance. Specifically, I wanted to go over like an interesting example I came around my research here. So there's this EHR at Beth Israel in Boston called Mimic 3 EHR, created with MIT. So essentially, it's this publicly available EHR. So Epic is a private EHR, so we're not able to get their data unless we go through a lot of hoops and we get a lot of clearances and whatnot for all the people who've done IRB things. But this specific EHR is a publicly available EHR. So you kind of just do a very like minimal way of like signing off, making sure that you're using the data on there. But it's made for other researchers to use this data within their research. And it's specifically only at Beth Israel. And it has data for over 58,000 ICU admissions. And it's a great public research tool. It's able to get help create clinical informatics, able to create machine learning models like we've been chatting about, but other data sciences, and it's able to be publicly seen and be able to publicly test it on there. But in itself, this data is limited because this Mimic EHR only being used at Beth Israel. Beth Israel takes about their patient population is about 65 to 70% white patients. So using this data is great, but in itself has its limitations because we're missing a ton of populations that represent minorities. We're missing a tons of different pathologies that they carry. So again, although this is a great thing that's being used and it's eventually going to be used more and more, this in itself has a big limitation. Another thing we're chatting about here is problem selection bias. So essentially, it occurs when the choice of problem or task is not representative of real-world problems that could lead to worsening inequity. So just like the data, this is a problem. So looking at the subset within the data is picking a problem that's not representative here. So essentially, kind of keeping the theme about University of Chicago here, data scientists, shout out to all the Chicago peeps here. So data scientists at the University of Chicago created this machine learning to predict hospital stays in order to optimize hospital resources. So they saw that patients, they created this ML model, and they were seeing which patients were staying at the hospital longer. And they noticed that it was going to be patients of color who were staying longer. And they were able to develop this tool, and they didn't know what was going to come out of this machine learning the output from it. They just put in this problem, they put in the data, and they saw that it was primarily individuals from poor zip codes that were staying longer and needed longer hospital stays. In theory, they could use this information to optimize hospital stays for white patients because they were staying shorter stays. You would see them earlier, you would move things faster for them to clear out more beds. But this in itself would create biases for marginalized communities. So, I think this is an example of looking at a problem and then getting an output that in theory would be helpful because you're getting these patients out as everyone knows here on the hospital wards. You see the patients that are going to get discharged sooner than later, so you're able to move things along. This algorithm really created like a very eye-opening situation for people at the University of Chicago. Another types of bias or another things we want to consider is the post-deployment consideration. Really, it occurs when we evaluate the effectiveness of medical interventions that's not available to minimizing bias. So essentially, with this example that we looked at with GI Genius, A little GI background, very basic. Proximal and sessile lesions are more challenging to detect than traditional adenomas. And then notably, Black patients are more likely to have these proximal lesions or these sort of sessile serrated lesions. And studies have shown that although GI Genius or other computer-aided detection models are better at picking up traditional adenomas, they may lack lower sensitivity when picking up these sessile lesions. So this in itself is a perfect example of how something that looks really promising can really exacerbate the inequities that we see currently right now. In theory, I think there's more misses that could happen with Black patients because they present more with these lesions. So I thought that was a really interesting example. Now let's talk about some pragmatic solutions here to it. One of the things that would be really important is to increase the diversity of patient population involved in these algorithms. In 2015, the NIH created this All of Us initiative, which was essentially putting their money where their mouth was, 130 million on funding to create this database that was diverse and was able to represent what the United States looks like. I think by 2045, white population will be less than 50%. So I think investing in these types of things, we're able to help our patients as we're, in our careers is going to be super important. And as AI moves closer and closer to from research to our bedside, it's going to be really important to have this data from patients that we're going to be seeing more on a regular basis, more and more. Another pragmatic solution is to incorporate equity into the design tools. So the example that I gave about the University of Chicago team, really when they discovered what was happening, they took action from their machine learning algorithm. They saw that their hospital discharging was creating worsening biases between where people were in the zip code. They eventually decided that all their data science unit would partner with the university's DEI department when developing these algorithms. So they saw this and took action, which in themselves give kudos to them just because it was a big catch for them and they took what they needed to do. So I think moving forward, I think having equity experts they don't have to be computer scientists themselves, but just having equity experts as these machine learning algorithms are developed, these devices are developed, I think it's going to be really, really key and really important. So we're not, again, exacerbating some of these equities that already exist. And I thought this was kind of one of the weirdest things as well, regulatory standards. So going back to our GI Genius, the FDA regulates that because that's a medical device. And the FDA regulates medical devices that include AI. But there's really not a comprehensive regulatory framework for AI that's not device used. In clinical medicine, there's different departments from the government that gives guidance. And I believe some of them were like let me see here, specifically, well, we'll chat about the names specifically, but there's not a regulatory framework that's being used currently right now, which I thought was really, really just something else, that there's no one who's formally regulating these machine learning models to help limit bias from AI in themselves here. And specifically, I thought it was interesting that the tech leaders, and this is not necessarily only limited to medicine, but tech leaders like was the Apple co-founder was Elon Musk. I think there was a couple of other big institutions like University of Texas and MIT. Big tech leaders were asking the United States government to take a pause from artificial intelligence just because they're worried about the societal impacts of it. The US government responded to that they would not take a pause, because if they took a pause, then they would be at a disadvantage from other rival countries like China and Russia. But I just think it's really, really eye-opening that these tech leaders are taking really a big they're worried about like some of these repercussions that AI can go to just because it's becoming more and more predominant. I think that ChatGPT kind of opened up the floodgates within AI, and then I think it's becoming more and more of a race now. I think Google's developing their own chatbot. Microsoft, Amazon, and every other big tech companies are developing it as well. So I think the cat's out of the bag now, and I think it really is hopefully going to move in the right direction. But in relation to these regulatory standards, I think, future regulations, it's imperative that we have transparent and diverse data sets, evaluations of the algorithms, and making sure that we're not perpetuating biases in there. So it's important to, as University of Chicago did, to incorporate AI experts with healthcare experts, ethicists, to encourage and develop the best and ethical, equitable uses of AI in medicine. And that is it. We got some chats going on here, and definitely feel free to unmute yourself at this point. I think Lily was saying, let's see, also wonder if we as a group will always be inherently wary of this because it threatens how we perceive our profession. Yeah, I think the big thing is, as like doctors, we always, we think of ourselves as the experts of what we're talking about, knowing that there's always somebody that knows more than we do. But we take pride in knowing that if we've seen something 100, 1,000 times, we more or less feel comfortable with it. That in itself, I think it's not only with medicine, but with like marketing, with law, with everything. I think there's going to be a lot of competition, and a lot of people put out of jobs because of AI. I don't think it's going to happen necessarily with like physicians themselves, but I do think it is going to be a lot of tension between what AI does in medicine and other things as well. Jordan asked if there's any research about liability when choosing to ignore AI clinical decision tools. There's really no big regulation. That's one of the big things, not that I know of, to answer that question. And one of the big things that I found was just like, there's really no regulate. It's like the Wild West right now with AI, and specifically AI in medicine. There's really minimal oversight unless it's a device. Then the FDA gets involved. But if it's not a device related, then there's really not a lot of oversight unless it's, I haven't seen an example, and I'm sure there may be an example where the government had to step in with a machine learning algorithm because it was like very, very biased or very, very inherently wrong to do. Yeah, I agree with Clinton when it comes to that as well. Cool. Any other questions or remarks, guys? I know this is going to be something that we are going to be, for better or for worse, going to be more and more as we practice, are going to be whether it's going to be part of our everyday practice at some point there.
Oh, there's a question at the end. In your research, did you come across any discussion around physician liability when choosing to ignore AI clinical decision-making tools?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, there wasn't any oversight from any like regulatory body unless it was device related. Okay, guys, that was pretty much it. Thanks so much for indulging me in my AI computer sciences path that I wore for a couple of weeks for this research.